The WGA says no deal to the latest counterproposals from the producers. I've got all the details right now. Hello everybody, I am Dan Murrell with the latest update on the Writers Guild of America strike. There was some hope that maybe a resolution was somewhere close because the producers and the writers were back at the table, they were negotiating. Well, those hopes may have been dashed because the latest news is not encouraging, so I'm going to bring you up to speed on what was said at those talks and why the writers now are so incensed once again at the AMPTP, the group of producers with whom they are negotiating. And let's start with a basic timeline of what's been happening recently. The last time I did a video about the strike, the writers were set to have a talk about having future talks about the contract. Those did end up happening. So this has been what the month of August has looked like so far with the WGA strike. On Friday, August 4th, the Writers Guild and the AMPTP did meet to discuss resuming negotiations, but that meeting ended with no talks planned. However, on Thursday, August 10th, the AMPTP reportedly invited the Writers Guild back to the table for further talks, and on Friday, August the 11th, the producers presented the WGA with new counter proposals. The Writers Guild then told their members that negotiations would be happening in the room privately, that they would not be providing a blow-by-blow breakdown of what was being offered. On Friday, August the 18th, last week, studio CEOs reportedly met to discuss the negotiations amid reports that some progress was being made. But then this Tuesday, August the 22nd, CEOs Bob Iger, David Zaslav, Donna Langley, and Ted Sarandos told the Writers Guild America in a meeting at the AMPTP that the August 11th offer that was on the table was their final and best offer. The AMPTP then released the details of that agreement to the media, and it's the release of that proposal from the producers and the media that completely set the Writers Guild off and may have killed talks for the foreseeable future, because when the two sides resumed negotiations, they were doing so under a voluntary media blackout, which basically meant that there would be, by an agreement on both parties, no leaks to the press about what the terms were, and that the Writers Guild would not be sharing what was being negotiated with their members, as they said in that email to the members, in order to give everybody a little bit of breathing room so that there wasn't a constant analysis of what they were talking about. It allowed kind of a more open negotiating tactic that you could maybe float ideas on both sides. By issuing that statement to the media with the full proposals that they had given the Writers Guild, the AMPTP broke that blackout, basically saying that if you don't share these terms with your members, Writers Guild of America Negotiating Committee, then we will share the term with your members. And the hope there, according to the WGA, is that it will sow division inside of the striking writers, that the writers will see these deals, these proposals that are on the table, that a lot of them will say like, well, wait a minute, I like this. You should take that deal. So then they pressure the negotiating committee and you basically fracture the writers that are on strike. That's why the WGA negotiating committee and the people at the top are so pissed, because they're looking at the AMPTP and saying like, wait a minute, you said that you were negotiating with us in good faith, and yet what it really looks like you were trying to do is back us into a corner, and then when you decided you wanted to release the terms of the deal, you decided to put it out there. And I understand that, honestly. I could see why that would be so frustrating, because you do think that you're in there and you're making this deal, and then all of a sudden the talks are basically ended and the stuff is thrown out there in the media, and you're in the position of having to react to what you thought was an ongoing negotiation. It's yet another, stupid ass power play from the AMPTP. And I usually save my editorializing for the end, and I'll do a lot more, trust me, but I am so sick and tired of this posturing, and it really is mostly coming from the producer sides, as far as, playing against each other. Oh, we want to negotiate for a few more days into July, and then they promote Barbie and all their other movies and say like, yeah, you know what, never mind, no deal, we're all going to go on strike. And then this whole negotiating thing where they basically present an offer on August 11th and then 10 days later go back and say like, well, no, this is our best and final offer after doing the negotiating with the WGA. This is so stupid and needless and ridiculous to keep playing these games, and yet here we are. So let's break this down, and then I'll go into a little bit more of my own personal feelings about it. I'm sure you can probably tell about where I land, but I want to talk about what was in this counter proposal from the producers, because this was the first actual counter that they gave the writers since negotiations broke down way back in May, when the strike started. So let's talk about what the writers were initially asking for, what the producers said when the strike began that led the writers to say, no deal, we're going on strike, and then what the AMPTP and the different producers are now offering. Let's start with a few issues where it seems like there was some substantial improvement. The first is the minimum pay increase across the board for WGA members. They had initially asked for a 6% increase in the first year of the contract and a 5% increase in years 2 and 3. Way back at the beginning of negotiations, the AMPTP offered a 4% increase in year 1 and then a 2% increase in years 2 and 3, as well as a one-time increase on residuals of 2 to 2.5%. The revised offer from the AMPTP is a 5% increase in year 1, which is 1% less than what writers initially asked for, a 4% increase in year 2, again 1% less than what the writers initially asked for, and then a 3.5% increase in year 3. And then there were also some new guarantees given to a particular class of writers called Article 14 writers. And Article 14 writers are the writers that are also producers. So that would be showrunners or consulting producers, associate producers, executive producers, where you are a writer on the show, but you also fulfill some kind of a producer responsibility. For those producers, the AMPTP offered a 15% increase in the first year, followed by the 4% increase in year 2 and the 3.5% increase in year 3 that they were offering all of the other writers. That means that for work up to 9 weeks, an Article 14 writer would make $11,371 per week. For work running from 10 to 19 weeks, it'd be about $9,500 guaranteed a week. And then for work from 20 to 29 weeks, it'd be about $8,500 a week guaranteed. And these are the salaries that I see kicked around by a lot of people saying, like, look at these ridiculous salaries. I'd sign a contract that would pay me $11,000 a week, which, yeah, just about anybody would. But this is one negotiating point inside of a much larger contract with the writers. The pay is just one thing. And honestly, looking at these terms, I think if this strike was just about the pay increase, then I think the strike would probably be over, because we have seen some substantial meeting in the middle when it comes to the producers and the writers on this specific issue, but this isn't the only issue that's at stake. And also keep in mind that writers don't work 52 weeks out of a year. Writers generally work substantially less time than that, and the whole point of this strike is that the number of episodes is going down, so even with these salaries, it's fewer episodes, it's fewer weeks of work, and the reason that the Writers Guild wants to get these salaries up higher is to compensate for the fact that writers aren't working as much, and they want to make sure that their members can still make a living in the profession. So the pay generally is what a lot of people push back on with the strike. The pay is just a small part of what's being negotiated. Something else that we saw some movement on was something called the second step for features, basically rewrites. The WGA had originally asked for guaranteed additional pay for feature script rewrites and revisions for writers that made 250% or less of the WGA minimum pay guarantee. The concern there was that you would hire somebody to write a screenplay, and then you go back to that writer and say, hey, I want you to do a rewrite for this, and they would not be compensated for that. And so it would be sometimes weeks and weeks more work that they basically had to do for free. And so what the Writers Guild wants is saying, like, hey, for people that aren't making exorbitant amounts of money with the script fee, so 250% of the minimum or less, we want to make sure they're compensated. Originally, the AMPTP basically offered nothing in return. They said that they would have informational meetings to talk about concerns with writer workload, but in their newest offer, they did offer a guaranteed second step for writers making 200% or less of the WGA minimum pay guarantee. They said that writers would be guaranteed to be given the first option of rewriting their own screenplay at no less than the minimum agreed upon compensation for rewrite work in the contract. And that's another term that is settled elsewhere in this agreement. What is the minimum amount for this kind of work? What is the minimum amount for this kind of work? So this is a victory really for the WGA in that they get that guaranteed second step for rewriting that they wanted. Another proposal surrounded compensation for movies on SVOD platforms, and SVOD would be streaming video on demand. Netflix, Disney Plus, Paramount Plus, basically the new streamers. The WGA asked that features for streaming video platforms that were budgeted at $12 million or more should be treated under the same terms as theatrical feature films as far as the base selling price for a script and the residuals that were received. The initial offer from the AMPTP a few months ago offered a 9% increase in the selling price for movies that were longer than 90 96 minutes with a budget of more than $40 million, but no increase in residual payments. The revised offer from producers offered an 18.3% increase in the minimum selling rate, so double the increase that they proposed a few months ago. This would still be for a feature longer than 96 minutes with a budget of more than $40 million and on a streaming platform with more than 20 million subscribers. The minimum amount for selling one of these scripts is now raised to $100,000, and they increased the residual base 25.7% to $75,000. So again, when you talk about negotiations, this isn't exactly what the writers wanted. It's more than the AMPTP wanted to give up initially. And if all of the sticking points in these talks had gotten to this point, again, I think we'd be talking about the end of the strike. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case, because there are some places where the writers and the producers are very, very far apart. One of those things is minimum staffing. The Writers Guild brought it to the table because they were tired, number one, of writers that were getting less work because shows are producing less episodes with smaller staff. And minimum staffing is also important to the WGA because it helps to address something called mini rooms. I explained it in my other video, but briefly, mini rooms are when a show is in development, or sometimes if a network is trying to figure out if they want to pick up a show, they'll bring in 2 or 3 groups of writers for a smaller amount of time and for much less pay to help a showrunner knock out some scripts so that the studio can kind of see a proof of concept to see if they want to do a show or not. And this is really not as lucrative for writers. A lot of times they don't get to continue on to the show if it gets picked up, but it does mean that they can't work on other shows. And it was considered by many in the WGA to be an existential threat, along with AI and some other things, to the writing profession, because you are paying a much, much smaller number of writers much less money to produce the same thing. So one of the things that they proposed was minimum staffing. Their proposal was that a show would have a 6-writer minimum prior to greenlight, and then after a show was greenlit or approved for production, the show would carry a staff of 1 writer per episode up to 6 episodes, then 1 writer for every additional 2 episodes up to a maximum of 12 writers. And the AMPTP rejected this outright with no counteroffer. So this is a place where they gave absolutely no ground when the strike began. Their new counteroffer applied to high-budget streaming video on demand programs, TV series, and serials. For shows that fall under these rules, the AMPTP offered that the program's showrunner would be able to select at least 2 writers to be employed for at least 20 weeks, not to exceed the duration of the writer's room being open. So this is very far apart from what the WGA wanted. This would basically just allow the person who is in charge of the show, Vince Gilligan or whoever, to say, okay, I pick these 2 writers and I will guarantee them 20 weeks of employment unless the writer's room closes before 20 weeks, in which case they would just be employed for the duration of the writing process. One issue that many people who are against this specific proposal have brought up is that the AMPTP does not, in this deal, define what a showrunner is. So a lot of people have said, like, well, you know, we could agree and say, okay, the showrunner gets to make this decision, and then the studios will say, okay, well, guess what? We're defining who the showrunner is, and the showrunner is this producer, and this producer doesn't want to do that. And so there is a lot of gray area in a proposal like this, but at least there is movement. I mean, the studios aren't completely stonewalling them. It's just that there's too much wiggle room. And again, this is obviously not, or should not be, have intended to have been a final deal, because no producer in their right mind, I mean, these CEOs, executives, producers, they understand how contracts work. They know that nobody in reality would agree to something this vague. Another WGA proposal involved the length of employment. And again, this was to guarantee work for writers and to help make sure that writers continue to get the experience of being on a show that's in production, that they could learn how the shooting process works, how the editing process works, which would allow them to develop skills to become better writers, to transition into directors or producers or whatever they want to do. The WGA's initial proposal was a 10-week guarantee of employment for writers prior to a show being greenlit, a 3-week guarantee per episode for each writer following a show being greenlit. They also wanted half of the staff, 50%, to be retained on payroll throughout the production of the show, meaning the principal photography, and then 1 writer retained as an employee throughout post-production on the show, or for 52 weeks, which would be an entire year. Again, the producers rejected this with no counteroffer a few months ago, but in the newest offer, they did give some terms following the closure of the writer's room, meaning the completion of the writing process on high-budget SVOD series, TV series, or serials that the showrunner, again, very vague word, the showrunner may select at least 2 writers to remain employed throughout production for at least 20 weeks, but not exceeding the length of production. So again, a far smaller number of writers than the WGA wanted guaranteed employment, but the option, at least from the studios, to allow a couple of writers to stay on and get that experience. But again, it's all in the gray area. Showrunner may select at least 2. The WGA wants very ironclad guarantees here. They don't get it from this version of the proposal, but again, this to me seems like it is progress. And I mentioned those mini rooms or development rooms, and the WGA really advanced a lot of proposals to eliminate the use of those rooms. That's where all of the minimum duration and minimum staff size came from. The AMPTP did not say that they would get rid of the development room or the mini room, but they did offer some guaranteed employment and a rate increase. So according to their new offer, the AMPTP said that development room writers or mini room writers are guaranteed 10 weeks of employment. For writers under Article 14, meaning your hybrid writer-producers, they increased the rate 43.8% to just over $14,000 per week. For staff writers, the rate was increased 31.3% to $6,959 per week. And then for story editors, the rate was increased to $12,978 per week. And the AMPTP always says this is also a minimum rate that the agents from these different writers could negotiate higher rates if they so desire. The AMPTP also notes that there's additional pay for writers who produce a script while working in a development room. So really, this is not at all, in some ways, what the WGA wants. They want the complete abolition of these development rooms, these mini rooms, and the AMPTP saying, well, you know, I think we're going to still keep doing them, but we'll pay you a little better for it. And so that's where you really have to weigh, if you are the WGA and you're going to your members, how much is this worth? Is it worth continuing to fight for the producers to get rid of this absolutely, which they don't seem like they want to do? Or is this extra compensation enough to justify the continued existence of the mini room? That's a question that I certainly don't know. And I think that the Writers Guild and a bunch of writers are going to have to ask themselves that question. But again, this kind of gives you an idea of whatever this final deal might be whenever we get it. It looks like maybe the mini room is not going to go away, but the compensation will increase. This next issue, however, is one that I don't know where they're going to find the middle ground here. I don't know if there is a middle ground here, and that is the use of artificial intelligence, because both the WGA and the AMPTP drew a pretty hard line initially. The WGA asked for a ban, a complete ban, on the use of AI to generate any material covered under the WGA contract. So no AI scripts of any kind. Also a ban on AI to generate source material as the basis for WGA work. And they asked for a ban on the use of WGA work to train AI. The AMPTP initially rejected those terms and offered only annual meetings to discuss concerns around technological advancements. So basically, go away, we're going to use AI, and we're not going to negotiate about that. In their new proposal, there was a little ground given on the AMPTP's part, but nothing along the lines of a complete ban on the use of AI. The AMPTP would only say, first of all, that they would guarantee that AI would never be recognized as a writer, and they also acknowledge that AI-generated material isn't considered literary material, quote-unquote, and that AI would never be credited as the original author. The studios also did not rule out the option of giving writers source material that was initially generated by AI. They only said that writers who were given AI material to rewrite would be paid as if they originally wrote that material. They would not be paid the lower rewrite fee. The studios also guaranteed that writers would be informed when they were given material to work with that was generated by AI, and that they would not be forced as writers to use AI in the writing process. But there were no guarantees made as far as using existing work to train AI on how to write screenplays, and there was no ban on the use of AI in writing whatsoever. This to me is not even a half measure. I mean, this is almost barely above what the producers were already offering. And to my eyes, the studios didn't really place any limitations on the use of AI at all. It was all about how a writer would be credited, how a writer would be paid, but that's not what the WGA is looking for, because I would imagine they'd say like, well, great, The one writer that you pay to write a screenplay that's generated by AI, sure, they may get paid well, but what about the 4 other writers that never get the chance to work because you're pumping out 20 AI-generated scripts a day? This is a huge issue, and I don't see anywhere close to a resolution here, and I wish that these two were still negotiating about it right now because this obviously needs a lot more work. Somewhere else where it seems like they're pretty far off is the idea of streaming residuals. The WGA had asked for the establishment of a residual system based on viewership for streaming platforms, in addition to the fixed residual system, and that the viewership numbers would be provided by the streaming services. Now, when the strike started, the AMPTP rejected the idea of a residual system and sharing that data with no counter offer. And there was an offer for some transparency, but again, I don't think anything close to what the writers wanted. In the new deal, the streaming services committed to providing the Writers Guild confidential data that contained the number of minutes that high-budget SVOD programs were watched on a quarterly basis, and that this data would serve as the basis to propose a new residual system in future negotiations. So there would be some transparency as far as data goes, although not public transparency, and no residual system on this contract, only the promise to use this data to talk about what a residual system might be in 3 years. I don't think that the writers are going to go for this, and it seems like it is a pretty wide gap between this and what the writers might accept. So overall, there's a lot of work to be done, but when you look at the terms and especially where they began in a lot of areas, it seems like they were very close to coming to an agreement. And I think that may be why the writers were so surprised when the AMPTP said that they were drawing a line in the sand and that this would be their final offer. This was the AMPTP statement on the night of August 22nd when they publicly released their proposal dated August 11th. They said, quote, "The Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers today released extensive details of its August 11th proposal to the Writers Guild, a comprehensive package which addresses all of the issues the Guild has identified as its highest priorities. The offer recognizes the foundational role writers play in the industry and underscores the company's commitment to ending the strike. This new package substantially improves upon the AMPTP's prior proposals. The comprehensive package also features first-of-their-kind offers for writers, including unprecedented terms in the areas of generative artificial intelligence, data transparency, and minimum staffing." So basically a boilerplate statement saying, hey, listen, this is a great deal. We all love it, and it gives them a lot more than what they asked for and a lot more than we were going to give them, without really acknowledging that they're not close in some areas to what the writers wanted. But, essentially the underlying point being they'd be dumb not to take this deal. Of course, because the Writers Guild is made of writers, their statements were much longer and went into more detail. So the first statement they made was on August 22nd, the night that the AMPTP released their proposal publicly. The writers said, quote, "After 102 days of being on strike and of AMPTP silence, the companies began to bargain with us on August 11th, presenting us for the first time with a counteroffer. We responded to their counter at the beginning of last week and engaged in further discussions throughout the week. On Monday of this week, we received an invitation to meet with Bob Iger, who's the head of Disney, Donna Langley, who's the head of NBC Universal, Ted Sarandos, who's the head of Netflix, David Zaslav, the head of Warner Brothers Discovery, and Carol Lambardini, who's the head of the AMPTP. It was accompanied by a message that it was past time to end this strike and that the companies were finally ready to bargain a deal. We accepted that invitation and in good faith met tonight in hopes that the companies were serious about getting the industry back to work. Instead, on the 113th day of the strike, and while SAG-AFTRA is walking the picket lines by our side, we were met with a lecture about how good their single and only counteroffer was. We explained all the ways in which their counter's limitations and loopholes and omissions fail to sufficiently protect writers from the existential threats that caused us to strike in the first place. We told them that a strike has a price, and that price is an answer to all and not just some of the problems they have created in the business. But this wasn't a meeting to make a deal. This was a meeting to get us to cave, which is why not 20 minutes after we left the meeting, the AMPTP released its summary of their proposals. This was the company's plan from the beginning, not to bargain, but to jam us. It is their only strategy to bet that we will turn on each other. Tomorrow we will send a more detailed description of the state of negotiations, and we will see you all out on the picket lines so that the companies continue to see what labor power looks like. That follow-up statement came not the next day on Wednesday, but yesterday on Thursday the 24th, where they specifically addressed some of the AMPTP's counterproposals. Here's what the WGA said, quote, in screen or screenplays, they have proposed a second step, but only for a statistically tiny category of screenwriters, excluding all but the first writers of original screenplays. They dismiss the concept of weekly pay. They have ceded selected but insufficient minimum terms for some but not all Appendix A writers in SVOD. For example, while comedy variety is covered, game show writers, daytime writers, and all other Appendix A writers are not covered. In television, the companies have introduced the notion of an MBA guarantee of minimum staff size and duration, but the loopholes, limitations, and omissions in their modest proposal, too numerous to single out, make them effectively toothless. We have had real discussions and seen movement on their part regarding AI protections, but we are not yet where we need to be. As one example, they continue to refuse to regulate the use of our work to train AI to write new content for a motion picture. Finally, the companies say they have made a major concession by offering to allow 6 WGA staff to study limited streaming viewership data for the next 3 years so we can return in 2026 to ask once again for a viewership-based residual. In the meantime, no writer can be told by the WGA about how well their project is doing, much less receive a residual based on that data. The company's counteroffer is neither nothing nor nearly enough. We will continue to advocate for proposals that fully address our issues rather than accept half measures like those mentioned above and other proposals not listed here. In the last 36 hours, the response from the membership is that you are undeterred by this latest tactic. Despite the AMPTP's attempt at a detour around us, we remain committed to direct negotiations with the companies. That's actually how a deal gets made and the strike ends. That will be good for the rest of the industry and the companies as well. Until then, we will see you on the picket lines. And really, that's where we stand right now. There are no current talks planned between the WGA and the AMPTP because the WGA feels like they're betrayed and the AMPTP says, well, there's nothing really else that we need to talk about. Really, we're right back where we started. The WGA's pissed off. They feel lied to. The AMPTP's gone back to their corner and the strike continues with no end in sight. And to pick up my editorializing again here, I am not a writer. I'm not a member of the WGA. I have friends that are in the WGA. I have even more friends who are in the industry, who have been out of work now for weeks due to the writer strike and due to the actor strike, along with the writers and the actors, because it's not just those industries that are affected. And the situation is getting dire because people are losing houses. People are moving on from the industry. There are movies and shows that are being canceled because financially they just can't continue to wait in limbo forever. This labor stoppage is very important. It needs to happen, in my opinion, because there are minimum guarantees that have to be made to writers and actors based on this new technology and based on these new methods of distributions. But the one thing that I think people have to understand is that this is not a game. But this is not just facts and figures. These are not just numbers on a spreadsheet or quarterly reports or your share price or your stock price. These are the lives of people, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, not just in the union, but outside of the union. And while you sit there and play games and propose terms and then say 10 days later that you're not going to budge on those terms after you've already gone through what the writers believed were actual negotiations, there are people that aren't working. There are people on the picket lines. There are people that aren't earning a paycheck. And every day it gets worse for them. And I will say on the part of the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild also, I'm not a big fan of the grandstanding that's going on. I don't need to see you on the news or in the trades or wherever telling me how bad the producers are. They've done a great job of doing their own bad PR. I really don't think anybody needs to be told who the bad guy in this negotiation is. Where I need to see the officials from the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild are at the table negotiating or on the picket lines. This needs to be resolved. It needed to be resolved weeks ago. It needs to be resolved right now. And I'm not saying that the writers or the actors should cave or take a deal that is going to hurt them in the long term, but there needs to be progress towards a deal every single day. Enough of the gamesmanship and the words and the trading press statements and the power plays and everything else. We are so far beyond that point. And somebody with authority, I don't know who that is, should be able to step in and force these two parties or three parties to be at the table negotiating. Even if they sit there and yell at each other for 8 hours a day, they should be at the table negotiating because this is a crisis. It is not just a crisis within the entertainment industry. It is an economic crisis in California and elsewhere. I've been covering this strike for a long time now, since the beginning of the summer, and I wish that I'd actually done more videos like this because it would mean that there were updates. But it looks like we may be getting to another one of these situations where it is weeks before I give you an update on what's going on with the writer's strike because nobody's talking. It's borderline criminal at this point, and the repercussions are already happening. Today, the day that the Writers Guild put out this big press release, Warner Brothers Discovery pushed the release date of Dune from November to March. So now Dune Part 2 isn't even coming out this year, and we are looking at a repetition almost of what happened with COVID. COVID was one of the worst things that ever happened to the movie industry, particularly the theatrical film industry. And here, because nobody can act like an adult and sit at the table and figure this out, we are looking at a self-imposed repetition of this same thing. And honestly, it may kill the damn industry for good. Pardon my French, but it's time for everybody to get their shit together and figure this out. Because if I'm this angry, I cannot imagine how angry somebody who's been on a picket line for weeks and months is feeling at this point. And that feeling of powerlessness, act like an adult, fix this, and let's get everyone to work as soon as possible. So that's my update with the WGA strike. I will be back if there are new terms that come to light, if we have any movement whatsoever on the SAG-AFTRA strike, because keep in mind, once the AMPTP settles with the writers, we have to wind the clock back to zero because they have to settle this with the actors as well. So this could be, we could really be in for a long haul here. But what do you think? Are you ready for the writers strike to end? What do you think of the terms that were proposed by the AMPTP? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, stay tuned right here for the latest movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.